Ladies and gentlemen, welcome along to Too Many Games. Today we continue in our video series on Epic Armageddon and we are looking at war engines. Yes, finally the rules for the big things in your collection that you want to play with. Titans and super heavy tanks and the like. Apologies for the delay in getting the video out. Real life has gotten in the way more than I wanted or had hoped for, but here it is at last. Thanks for your support on the channel and the videos that we have. Lots of great ideas coming from people too about what other types of videos to do on the channel. So look forward to more great videos in the future. Just time's been a bit of an issue and I've had this ready to go, just haven't had time to record. But here we are now and hopefully we'll start the aerospace ones really soon after this too. So let's have a look today. War engines. When we talk about war engines in Epic Armageddon, we're talking about things like the big things, Titans, Gargants, Bio-Titans, Baneblades, Thunderhawks, super heavy grav tanks of the Eldar, etc., etc. You'll find anything that is a war engine will have it listed on the data sheet under the unit type. It won't be infantry or armored vehicles, but it will say WE usually on the data sheet. Stands for war engine, obviously. All war engines also have a damage capacity, which will identify them as war engines too, and is recorded on their data sheet. It may just say DC followed by a number. This is essentially how many kills it takes to destroy it, or you might prefer to think of it as to how many wounds it has, or it takes to how much damage it can take. It's its hit points in essence. So when using a war engine, you'll find a lot of rules and situations will refer to this as the starting damage capacity, and it's essentially how many units the war engine is worth in a sense. But more on damage capacity later. Just know that this DC value that you see on the data sheet is the starting damage capacity. Let's look at moving our war engines. Well, thankfully, war engines move like other units, so not 1,000 extra rules to remember. They are still susceptible to dangerous terrain like other units. Just refer to the terrain chart that we saw in the video on dangerous terrain and take tests as normal. So let's do our first FAQ for war engines. And the question that we have for that straight up says, what happens to a war engine that fails a dangerous terrain test? And the answer is that it takes a point of damage and check for a critical, but does not take a blast marker. So nice and simple, just take a wound on your war engine, and you do not need to check for critical hits, but we will talk on that more soon. Okay, on to formations of war engines. Most war engines will operate as a single unit formation as a standard. However, you will find that smaller war engines may be part of a unit that may operate as multiples of the war engine in a single formation. Or like a formation of Baneblades, for example, or a couple of Warhound Titans, but it could also be mixed. So how does it work with coherency and distance from other units in the formation? Well, it doesn't have to obey the standard 5 centimeter rule that most units are held to, but instead a war machine counts as being in the formation, in formation, if it is within its starting damage capacity multiplied by 5 centimeters of another unit in the formation. What does that mean? So it's starting DC times 5 centimeters. So a Baneblade is damage capacity 3, so it's allowed to be 15 centimeters away from another unit in its formation. 3 times 5 centimeters is 15 centimeters. So you're allowed a little bit more room. It just depends on that starting damage capacity that we talked about just before. And there's an FAQ once again coming out of this. How do formations that contain war engines and non-war engines units form a chain to be a legal formation? So obviously some formations are made up of both war engines and regular units. So how does the distance work when it comes to that? And it's pretty simple. Every non-war engine unit must be within 5 centimeters of at least one other unit, while war engine units must be within a distance equal to their starting damage capacity times 5 centimeters of at least one other unit. So regular units still need to abide by the 5 centimeter rule, and war engines can spread out more, as we just heard with that DC times 5 centimeter rule. Now on to zones of control, and war engines do have zones of control just like other units in the game, but it takes more than just a single unit to remove the zone of control when in assault. given the commanding nature of their presence, I imagine. So they only lose their zone of control when they are in base contact with as many units as their starting damage capacity. So once again, if we're looking back at the damage capacity for the War Engine, which happens a fair bit, so a Bane Blade, for example, keeps its zone of control until there are 3 units in base contact with it, because of that the starting damage capacity of 3. It just means you can't throw a single unit into base contact with the War Engine, then ignore them and run past when making your charge move. So you do need to have as many units in base contact as the starting damage capacity of the War Engine. So what about War Engines as transports? And you will find as you play Epic that you will come across some War Engines that are also transports, or maybe they are primarily transports. They may not be the killy giant titans made for destruction only, but as a transport they can break the normal rules and they're able to transport units that come from another formation. However, the restriction to this is that you must be able to transport the entire formation of units. You can't just transport a couple of units from that formation. So they're a little bit different to regular transports, a bit more flexibility. But another note, when transporting units in its own formation, it's held to just the standard rules for transporting units, so it doesn't have to carry every unit in its own formation. It's only if it's a different formation it wants to transport. A little confusing, but it's pretty easy when you get on the table. Let's continue with more transporting rules. So embarking works a little differently. Units that are embarking onto the War Engine must be able to move into base contact with it during their action, which is different to the normal transport rules. Differently too, the War Engine can take an action before this embarking occurs, but cannot take an action after this happens, after the units have mounted up. So it really slows down your War Engine potentially. If you've already taken an action, like moved up, then you're fine. But if not, then you can't do any actions once these units have climbed aboard. So you can't load them up and then assault with that transport. It can stop a few things like that could be a bit cheeky, I suppose. And the units within the War Engine being transported cannot do anything while being transported. So no shooting or other actions, but they can still rally as normal in the end phase, thankfully. So you may or may not remember that, but just try and keep it in mind. Just because they're mounted up means that they doesn't mean that they don't get that rally at the end of the turn. Okay, so still some more on transporting with War Engines. So once units are embarked on a War Engine, that War Engine is free to move off in a subsequent turn. So remember, not the turn you load up on, but the subsequent turn. Units being transported can disembark as they normally would at the end of any move the War Engine makes. So that's nice, just like regular transports. The units that are disembarking are also under some heavy restrictions, however, and they are not able to take an action in the turn that they disembark in. So they're kind of stuck being placed where they get out. However, again, there is a saving grace for them. They are able to shoot or even assault when they disembark from the War Engine if the War Engine was able to do so. So it depends on what action the War Engine took, but you could shoot or assault into the same combat with the War Engine. So that makes it pretty powerful. You just couldn't then do another action after that. In both these cases, both formations will count as a single formation until the action like shooting or assault is resolved, and then they are separate formations. So again, not as flexible with War Engines as transports. They do stop you from doing things with your War Engine after loading up, or with the unit that disembarks after it's disembarked. So just keep that in mind, but again, they are quite powerful units to be transported in. So let's have a look at an example of this. And here we have an Orc battle fortress. Well, kind of. It's not quite the right picture, but just use your imagination. We'll say it's an Orc battle fortress. It moves forward with a single move. It then unloads the formation of Orcs that are being transported in it. Now, these Orcs couldn't take any more actions this turn, since they have just disembarked from the transport, so they're kind of stuck in place. But thankfully, the War Engine took the advance action, which allows it to move and then shoot. So the War Engine shoots, And the Orc boys are free to join in if they want. But they count as a single formation still for the purposes of the shooting and must shoot at the same target as a result. And after that, there'll be 2 separate formations. Simple. The same would work for assault. If the battle fortress assaulted up, the boys could jump out and also join in the assault after that assault's worked out. They're 2 separate formations. So as we might expect, there are some frequently asked questions that arise from this. Not surprisingly, can a war engine transport more than 1 formation? And the answer is yes. So that's actually pretty cool. It may not happen very often, but on bigger transports, you can throw a few units in together. Can a formation of war engines split another formation of troops amongst them to transport? And no is the answer. A single war engine from a separate formation cannot transport part of another formation. So there's some inflexibility here. You can't separate the units across multiple war engines to transport them. So you are held to kind of some inflexibilities. A unit's trapped inside a war engine if it is in base contact with 2 enemy units. So that's a standard rule that transports are under when in assault, if you remember back to our other videos, not so recent. And the answer is no. So they're not trapped in if 2 enemy units are in base contact, only if it is in base contact with a number of enemy units equal to twice its starting damage capacity. So again, we're going back to that starting damage capacity, and it makes it a bit harder for people to lock people inside of war engine transports in assaults. So, you look at that starting damage capacity and double it. So a Baneblade is 3 damage capacity. So you double that, so you need 6 enemies in base contact in an assault. Obviously a Baneblade's not a transport, but that's how that works. All right, probably a poor example. So looking at how war engines interact with shooting now, and thankfully we will see that war engines generally act as armored vehicles do when it comes to shooting. But there are some exceptions, but fear not, it won't be 1,000 rules once again. So let's have a look at a few things around that. So allocating hits to war engines works a little bit differently. You don't just allocate 1 hit to a war engine and then move on as you would with regular units. Instead, you apply a number of hits to the war engine equivalent to its damage capacity. Mind you, that it is their current damage capacity, not their starting damage capacity. So if they've taken some damage already, you've got to factor that in. After you've allocated as many as is needed to kill it, essentially, you then move on to other units and you allocate to them, if there are other units in the formation, obviously. Next up, when targeting a formation that has both war engines and other units in it, you must declare when firing which attacks are against the war engines and which of your attacks are not. Any hits that are scored from attacks against the war engines must be allocated to them, whilst the hits from the attacks of the other units cannot be allocated to the war engines. So you do have to kind of split your attacks up when targeting that mixed unit and choose these ones go at war engines, these ones go at the other units. So you can't hide war engines behind units, other units, and vice versa. You can choose when you attack, but that makes it a bit tricky on how many to put where. Okay, let's continue moving on. A little more on allocating hits against war engines. This time we come to templates and how they work. Usually, if you recall, a template placed over a regular unit will do 1 attack at each unit. However, let's have a look at an example of that. 3 attacks are made against the Leman Russes and can score a max of 3 hits in this example because a template covers 3 Leman Russ units. All covered, 1 hit each, 1 attack each. Nice and easy. Against war engines, it's a little different. A war engine that is targeted by template and is underneath the circle of the template, so that bit right in the middle of the template, will take attacks equal to half the number of the starting damage capacity of the war engine. So in our example here, this Baneblade is targeted and it lies underneath the central circle. So it will take 2 attacks from the weapon as its starting damage capacity is 3. So half rounded up when hit if you lie under that central hole. If not, it's just a single attack. So remember, you still have to roll to hit as you would normally, but it's just determining how many attacks you'll actually have from that template against the war engine. So some questions coming out of this. How many units does a war engine in the target formation count as with regards to placing a barrage template? And the answer is a number equal to its starting damage capacity. So once again, we're going back to that damage capacity. It's worth that many units essentially. If a war engine is under multiple templates from the same barrage, is it subject to more attacks than normal? And the answer is no. So even a big attack with 2 or 3 templates just does the same simple calculation for attacks against it. It doesn't get bonus hits against it for multiple templates touching it. Okay, so now talk a bit about damage capacity for war engines, and we've kind of talked about how that kind of works a bit with regard to other rules, but let's wrap our heads around it now. Damage capacity can most easily be understood as how many hits a war engine can take before being destroyed. Every unsaved hit lowers the damage capacity of the war engine by 1. And when this damage capacity hits 0 or equals 0, then the war engine is destroyed and should be removed from the game. As with regular formations, every point of damage that the war engine suffers will mean a blast marker is placed on the war engine or the formation that it's part of. So war engines also will potentially suffer critical hits as well as they take damage. So every time a war engine removes a point of damage from its damage capacity, you roll a d6. If the result is a 1 to 5, you just lose 1 damage as normal, like you would expect to, but on a 6, something different happens. You still remove that 1 damage, but you also suffer a critical damage effect. What is that? Well, the effect of the critical hit for the war engine will be listed on the data sheet of that particular unit. So it depends on what the war engine is as to what that critical effect is, which allows a bit of variety between different war engines. The effect of multiple critical hits that occur on the war engine are cumulative as well. So again, it depends what those effects are, but they are cumulative. Okay, so some FAQs once again, this time around critical hits. Does the hit here refer to hits that have been allocated to the war engine or hits that have reduced the war engine's damage capacity by 1 point? And again, this is kind of looking at just that lingo that we use, that language in Epic. It can be a little bit confusing sometimes, but here it's saying hits that have reduced the war engine's damage capacity by 1 point. So it's basically saying the hits that you didn't save or you couldn't save, the ones that actually got through, reduce your damage capacity down. That's when you check for critical hits. If a critical hit's effect causes additional hits, do these have a chance of causing critical damage? So if you roll up a critical hit and it says do another hit, lose another damage capacity, however I might say that, can you then roll again for a critical? And the answer is yes. So you can have multiple critical hits trigger in a row. Kind of like exploding dice in a bad way for you, I guess. But okay, next question. If a critical hit's effect is resolved in the end phase, and this results in another critical hit, is that resolved immediately? So would you resolve multiple in the end phase? And the answer is no. It would be resolved in the next turn's end phase. So you wouldn't just keep rolling that up in that particular end phase. Again, they're kind of situational depending on the critical effects, but they can come up. So just if you're wondering with that, just remember, check back. The FAQs are always very helpful around this stuff. And good, because we have more of them. If a critical hit's effect destroys units in another formation, so say it explodes, does that formation receive a blast marker for coming under fire? And the answer is no. No, they don't. Nice and easy. If a critical hit's effect destroys units during an assault, are those units counted for the purposes of working out the result of the assault? And the answer is, if the unit's formation was part of the assault, then yes. So a critical effect can affect the assault result which is kind of cool. If it blows up, if it hurts other people, it's kind of cool that they can change the assault result, but only for units that are part of the assault, obviously. And are critical hit effects cumulative? Which we already just read, but it's still a question. Yes, they are. So they do stack, they do add up. Okay, let's have a look at blast markers and war engines now. So as you could probably predict with war engines, every time a war engine loses a point of damage, its formation, whether just itself or part of a bigger one, will suffer a single blast marker. So 1 wound equals 1 blast marker essentially, or 1 lost damage capacity equals a blast marker. If it is destroyed by a critical effect without losing all its damage capacity, because some critical effects can just destroy you straight away, then you apply blast markers to its formation equal to the remaining damage capacity it had at the time. So let's say you hit that Bane Blade, first point of damage comes off and it drops from 3 to 2 on its damage capacity. You roll a crit, that crit destroys the Bane Blade. It's got 2 damage capacity left, so it adds 2 more blast markers to its formation. So whatever's left on it, when it gets destroyed by a crit effect, it adds on in blast markers. And so how do they interact with blast markers? Well, a war engine will require a number of blast markers equal to its starting damage capacity in order to break it. So nice and simple, we're going back to that starting damage capacity again. If the war engine is part of a formation, that includes other units, then add the starting damage capacity to the formation when calculating the break point for the formation. So it's nice and simple. You don't count it as 1 unit, you count it as its starting damage capacity worth of units for that formation. So it becomes quite intuitive as you start to use these units more, particularly if you do run armies that mix war engines in with regular units quite often. Perhaps like an orc army that I run, it does that, and it becomes very intuitive. Okay, more on blast markers. When is a war engine broken? It will count as when it's broken when it has as many blast markers on it as its starting damage capacity. So once that equals the starting damage capacity, it will be broken. And when we come to withdrawal moves, after you take withdrawal moves, if there are enemy units within 15 centimeters of a war engine, then the war engine suffers 1 additional point of damage with no saving throws allowed for it. And that's 1 point per unit that is within 15 centimeters. So as you imagine, that could add up pretty quickly. So for every unit within 15 centimeters, suffer 1 extra point of damage. And there's no saves for that. Additional hits caused from losing an assault or by receiving blast markers while you're broken, they also cause 1 point of damage with no saves to the war engine. So as you might predict at that point. And one thing to note, that all these additional hits that war engines take, whether they're from withdrawal moves or from losing assaults, they all cause critical hits as normal. So you still roll for each one of those. So if a war engine's broken and it gets a blast marker on it, it suffers that damage capacity reduction of 1 and rolls for a critical as normal. Okay, FAQ time. So there's a lot of FAQs around war engines, as you're beginning to see. Does a war engine's formation receive a blast marker if its critical hit effect causes a point of damage? And the answer is yes. So you really are making checks for criticals when damage is taken by a war engine in most instances. Okay, on to Titan killer weapons. If we've got these Titans coming out against us, then we need to bring out the big guns, the Titan killers. They're the biggest and most destructive weapons generally in Epic. And as a result, enemy units that are hit by a Titan killer weapon cannot take any saves, armor or cover, even if you have the reinforced armor special rule. So these hits are big and they just melt through armor. You cannot roll any saves against it, with the exception of a few particular units, but we won't get into that here. So generally, you can't do a thing. However, if you are in cover, it might ignore the cover save for your unit, but the -1 to hit is not ignored. So cover modifiers still apply against Titan killer weapons, which is good to know if someone's using them against you when you're in cover. Okay, more on Titan killers. Some Titan killers will have a dice roll written in the weapon profile after the usual stats, such as D3. So it might say Titan killer D3. When a war engine is hit by that attack, so not a regular unit, just the war engine, you roll the die in the data sheet and the war engine suffers that much damage. This means that the war engine basically reduces its damage capacity by 1 for each point of damage you roll up. So that D3, if you rolled 3, it would suffer 3 points of damage instead of just 1. So it can be very deadly, particularly when you get Titan killer D6 weapons that can do a lot of damage to a war engine. Each point of damage, as you would gather, reduces the damage capacity by 1. So already said that there. Let's have a look at more on Titan killers. We still roll for critical hits for each point of damage inflicted. Not just once for that initial hit of the Titan killer, but if you roll up 6 damage on your D6 attack, you roll for 6 crits. If the Titan killer has no dice roll in the bracket listed, then it only does 1 damage, and you don't cause multiple hits. So that's reassuring. If you get hit by 1, it just does 1. Now when it comes to allocating to units, you allocate the hit to the war engine and then roll the die mentioned by the Titan killer. The war engine being hit counts as being allocated as many hits as equal to the roll of the dice. Once these hits are allocated, damage is applied normally. Okay, on to an important part again, assaults and how war engines work. And as you might appreciate, war engines follow some special rules for assault. But before that, we'll interrupt with some FAQs already. First up, can a war engine transporting a broken formation assault? And the answer is yes, but any broken formations being transported may not disembark and fight in the assault. If they are forced to disembark due to the war engine being destroyed, then they are destroyed as well. Note that they do count as taking part in the assault, however, and affect the assault modifiers when working out the result. So yes, you can charge into assault if you are transporting a broken formation. That formation can't do anything, but it could be a liability if the transport war engine dies, because they are destroyed straight away and they count towards that assault. Okay, can a unit use its consolidation move to get into a war engine? Yes, they can, but the war engine may not make a consolidation move. So you can consolidate back into a war engine that is a transport, much like normal transports, but it can't go anywhere itself. So that's very good to know. Okay, charge moves for war engines. War engines, being large and aggressive, like you might imagine, are able to barge enemy units when they charge into assault. And this is quite fun, and it allows them to jostle their way right into the middle of an enemy formation potentially. It's simple to do. Just move the war engine as far as you desire and legally are able to, and then you take the barged units and place them as close to their starting positions as possible, but you make sure that they're in base contact with the war engine. And it's a nice way to get right in the thick of it. But let's have a look at an example, just so we know exactly how that works. And in this example, we have a Titan, an Imperial Titan, and some Orc boys. It doesn't look good for the Orc boys. And the Titan assaults into the middle of the boys, displacing 4 of the 5 units, as you can see. So we place those 4 units as close as we can to their starting positions, but in base contact with the Titan. A cool little ability for war engines. Okay, continuing on with charge moves. War engines that charge cannot barge other war engines out of the way. So you can only do it to lesser units, so to speak. Nice and easy. When barging units, the maximum number you can barge is equal to 2 times the starting damage capacity of the war engine. So there is a limit, and that limit is twice the number, which is the number that you can get into base contact with, essentially, with this rule. We also see that when a war engine is charged, the number of enemy units that can be placed into base contact with it is equal to twice the starting damage capacity of the war engine. So it's reflected in both these. When you charge or when they charge you, twice the number of your starting damage capacity is the maximum for units in base contact. So for example, a Bane Blade, once again we go back to it, starting damage capacity of 3, is allowed to barge up to 6 units when charging, and is allowed to have 6 units placed in base contact with it when it gets charged. So coming back to that starting damage capacity, and a lot of the time it's either twice that or the same as. Again, you'll learn that as you get used to war engines. So FAQs, once again, can war engines barge units out of the way with a countercharge? And the answer is yes. So countercharges work like regular charges in this sense, making it hard to block out a war engine in assault. Can a war engine barge one formation and assault another? No. A unit can't enter an enemy's zone of control unless it's assaulting that unit's formation. So some consistency in the rules, and you can't go into an enemy's zone of control unless you're assaulting them. Doesn't matter if you're a big titan and they're not. In this case though, perhaps an intermingled formation assault could occur depending on the positioning. Just something to think about. See the videos on assaults if you want to know more about intermingled assaults, but that would be one option. Another FAQ, can a war engine barge a unit and then move away from other units to deny attacks? And the answer is yes, but only if the war engine doesn't enter another unit's zone of control. A war engine is still required to move into base contact with an enemy unit if it enters its zone of control. So you're getting some corner cases here, but these situations could come up. Not important to commit to memory now. Just know that there are FAQs on barging, probably a helpful thing to think about at the moment, which may help you when you start using your war engines and start assaulting and wanting to barge enemy units. How many units does a war engine making a charge move count as when moving into base contact with an enemy unit? So does it count as 1 or 2 or more? And the answer is 1. So a war engine may have a number of units equal to twice its starting damage capacity in base contact with it, but it still only counts as 1 unit when it moves into base contact with another. For example, once again, the Bane Blade with a damage capacity of 3 could be contacted by up to 6 enemy shadow swords. So the starting damage capacity rule doesn't change how many units you count as, just how many can charge you. Your war engine still counts as just 1 unit, so 2 war engines could charge a single unit quite easily. Okay, another question. Can a war engine countercharge if it has enemy units in base contact? Now this is a big answer for something that seems kind of simple, and there is nothing in 3.3, that's the rule section, specifically overrides defending units that are not already in base contact with an enemy unit are allowed to countercharge from 1.12.4. Probably not important to know all those references unless you want to look it up. However, war engines are allowed to barge as part of their countercharge, so it should be brought up in the 5-minute warm-up. A suggested compromise is to mirror how a war engine loses its zone of control, so as long as the number of units in base contact with a war engine is less than its starting damage capacity, it may countercharge. So a tricky one here with no clear rule, but a suggestion on how to play it. And this would be my suggestion to follow this guide, only allowing the barge countercharge if it isn't in base contact with as many units as its starting damage capacity. That is a very long-winded way to say that, and I wouldn't worry too much about that at the moment, but know that that reference is there, and I would just use that suggestion, quite honestly. Okay, so now we're almost at the end of our war engine rules. Getting real close now. No, it's been a long one. Let's have a look at how war engines work with both close combat and firefight attacks, as this is important and what can make them very powerful. So when you're attacking with either close combat or a firefight attack, you roll the number of dice equal to the starting damage capacity of the war engine. So a starting damage capacity of 3 will give you 3 attacks. So this is not a single attack unit, but your big war engines get a big number of attacks to go along with them, which is great to know. Furthermore, you can split these attacks between a firefight and close combat as you like, which is great to know. There's some flexibility there, particularly if you have special weapons that you want to use. And if someone gets you in base contact, you aren't locked to that type of attack according to the rules. Your close combat attacks will simply hit units in base contact, and your firefight attacks will hit units not in base contact but still within 15 centimeters. So if you do split them up, just know that there is a limit to how many units you could hit with either of those. Okay, lastly, we have the results part of the assault and how war engines fit into that. When calculating the results, you are going off each point of damage inflicted to a war engine, counting as a single casualty for the purpose of the result. So 2 damage done to the war engine counts as 2 casualties during the tally up phase of the assault. So that's how you do it. Every lost damage capacity counts as 1 casualty. Also, when calculating the number of units in the assault for purposes of outnumbering, each war engine counts as a number of units equal to the starting damage capacity of that war engine. Nice and simple. And finally, when a war engine loses an assault, instead of the casualties you normally suffer, the war engine will take an extra point of damage for each point it lost the assault by. And we've already mentioned that, but I'll mention it again. With this damage, you still roll for critical hits as normal. That is to say, you roll for each point of damage that is done. So when you lose an assault, take those extra points of damage. Well, we made it once again to the end of another video in our Epic Armageddon series. There was a lot of FAQs in that, and it was quite a big one. But hopefully you enjoyed today's video and learned a lot about war engines and how they work in Epic Armageddon. They are in some way the pin-up units of Epic, and they bring a lot of tactical depth to the game. Plus they look great, they're fun to use, they're great to build and to paint. So you'll have lots of fun using your army's war engines, I've got no doubt. The next video in the series is going to look at aerospace units, though I will split it into 2 videos, otherwise it'll be too long. One on aircraft first, and then the other on spacecraft. Hopefully you'll enjoy that one too. Feel free to like or subscribe if you want to see the rest of this series, and I'll try to respond to any comments you may leave as well. See you next time on Too Many Games.